Good morning, everyone. My name's Jackie Kitching. I'm Head of Corporate Finance at RSM South Africa. I'm joined this morning by Alistair Maxwell, who's our Chief Operating Officer. So welcome and thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. The topic of this morning's webinar is the importance of the operational due diligence. And I think what I'm going to do is to just kick off and just talk about a due diligence in general and what is a due diligence. And then Alistair will take us through the importance of the operational due diligence. So if we talk about due diligence, I think Alexander Lejoux summarized it quite nicely when he said that the basic function of any due diligence is to assess the benefits and liabilities of an acquisition by incurring into all the relevant aspects of the past, present, and predictable future of the business to be purchased. Because in essence, what a due diligence is the gathering of information and data and then analyzing that in order to make an informed decision about a particular transaction. So that I think just summarizes it quite nicely in terms of what the due diligence process is. If we look to the different aspects of a due diligence, we've essentially categorized it at this stage into three fundamental aspects or components of the due diligence process. I think the first part would be the commercial due diligence, and essentially from a commercial due diligence perspective, you need to consider the markets in which you're going to be working. What are the assumptions around those markets? What are the key drivers? So that's in essence what you look at when you're looking, is this particular transaction commercially viable? We then move on to the financial side of things. So we look at the financial due diligence, and this in essence focuses on all the financial information. So it looks at your historical financial statements. It looks at the performance of the business, the target. It assesses the assets and liabilities. You look at both past, present, and potentially future cash flows. You look at potential synergies, cost savings, or in truth, any additional costs that would need to be incurred as part of this process. And then the third focus point in terms of a due diligence would be the legal side of things. Now, the legal side of things takes on a number of different shapes and forms because it's quite a broad area that needs to be covered from a legal perspective. But I think the first focal point in terms of the legal due diligence would be to assess, well, what is the shape of this transaction? So is this transaction going to be potentially a sale of business, a sale of shares, or does it need to take some other shape or form that needs to be fleshed out? So that would be the first aspect from a legal DD side. We would then look at things like commercial contracts. What sort of contracts are part of the business? Are there clauses in those contracts that would need to be negotiated if there's a change of control in terms of the businesses? The other aspect of the legal due diligence would be to look at compliance. So is the particular target complying with all the legislative aspects of the particular industry in which they operate? And that then also goes and talks to, for example, from a tax perspective, are there risks involved from a tax perspective in terms of non-compliance and the like? So I think in summary, those are all the different aspects of the due diligence process. And in essence, they look at risks, they look at synergies, they look at all of those types of things in terms of the businesses as they stand at this point in time. So the main focus is primarily in terms of getting the deal done and what is the best way to get the deal done. But in truth, you then have a deal that is done. You have two businesses that are now coming together. and they need to then be viable into the future. And I think that in essence is where the operational due diligence comes into play, because that in essence is forward looking. So how do we make this combined business or entity work going into the future? So I'm going to hand you over to Alistair now, and he's going to take us through the processes in terms of an operational due diligence and why we believe it to be an important part of the due diligence process.
Thanks, Jackie. Good morning, everybody. Jackie spoke about what usually happens around traditional views of a due diligence, and that it's more focused on the here and now and what's happened historically. But then how do we actually bring in that more forward-focused view, a little bit more rigor and visibility of forward projections into a merger or an acquisition? But also, more importantly, how do we make sure that we can bring in actually attaining the investment case that's been put forward? This is where an operational due diligence has come from. Is historically, deals would be done specifically in the private equity space, and they'd have these investment theses that said we'd get a 24% return. That never usually occurred. And operational due diligence came from that historic background as to why were we not achieving those goals that we put in place at the start of the transaction. So at RSM, we define an operational due diligence as a forward-looking perspective that actively manages a transaction and achieves it to help it achieve its investment thesis, as well as creating additional value. It describes and evaluates the business from an operational perspective and provides credible plans with evidence of sustainability. That's a nice slogan, but how does that actually work in progress, in real life? Sorry, forgive me. If you look at the typical value chain of any deal, any merger or acquisition, they fall into four main areas: the investment thesis, the valuation, the sale and purchase agreement, and then the integration planning. But now, how do we bring that forward focus and that rigor in? It's very easy to see that if we're talking about bringing rigor into a merger and an acquisition, what we spoke about in the previous slide, that the primary focus area would be to spend more time on the investment thesis and the integration planning. And these do form the core areas for an operational due diligence. But what are their main objectives? If we just look at the investment thesis side of the transaction, how do we review the underlying market and economic factors associated with the deal? Why is this deal strategic? What's the drivers behind that? There could be numerous reasons as to why we're doing a deal, whether it's on the buy or the sell side. How do we assess the sustainability of future operations? Can we identify actions and investments that accelerate value creation right now at the start that can go into the investment thesis that will allow you to try and identify value through the transaction? And the other main focus of an operational due diligence is to advise the deal team on the strategic fit of a transaction. Now, this can happen even before you've entered into a deal. And then there's a proactive piece to this, is if you've really understood internally your own company, that could then say, based on our next 5 to 10 year strategy, we should be looking at an acquisition in this kind of market. If we then go down and look at it from the back end of the deal, the integration planning, operational due diligence focuses on driving the integration planning process, identifying short and long-term value creation goals and projects. It considers, and this is quite important, both the past and potential future information in assessing risk and reward. Very often I've seen deals where people have gone through and said, well, there's a synergy here, but they haven't really understood the risk and reward factor or the difficulty in getting a change made. And that's what an operational due diligence allows you to do, is to assess the implementation complexity of making a change in a business and how ready you are for it. So you might get a lot of value from doing a certain change, but if the risk is very high to the business, it might not be worth making that specific saving or that specific focus in the integration planning. The other main area of an ODD, it allows you to monitor key initiatives post-deal to ensure that those benefits are achieved and that the investment thesis doesn't become a document in a file somewhere that we just look at and go, that was great, but we didn't really get there. And then the other advantage that it has is it gives you the space to identify additional synergies and changes operationally in the business post the deal to make sure that you can unlock potentially more value that does sit there. Now, the first question I usually get asked after this is, Alistair, that's great, but how do you increase value? It's great. It's a great question, and this is how we would look at it. If we take any business, we can break it down as a combination of business model and an operating model. And this, for me, I like to break that down into a further eight additional areas if we look at it. So we can see in the green there that the business model is made up of, for me, I classify it as your markets, your propositions and your brands, your customers and your channels. Your operating model, we break that down into 5 key areas: your core business processes, your technology, your organizational structure, your people and culture, and your measures and incentives. How are you making sure that you're achieving your goals? Now, an operational due diligence focuses on both of these simultaneously. We can do one or the other, but the most value comes from looking at both of these at the same time. From a business model perspective, these are the 5 key questions for me that need to be answered if you're doing an operational due diligence. What does a winning business model look like in the future for us? What is the sustainable advantage that we will get as a result of this transaction? How will it be achieved? Where do we want to play in the value chain of our market? Ultimately, what do you want to be famous for? That's a core view that goes to the strategy of a deal. What platforms can you develop and prioritize? How do you change your go-to-market strategy? Does this augment it? Does it give you a new potential customer base? Where are we sitting there? And then that leads to the last point. How do you actually maximize revenue in your share of the customer's wallet? So all of those form a key focus of an operational due diligence. If we then, so that drives the top line, but there's another part of the equation that's the bottom line, the operating model. An ODD's focus there is, what are the core capabilities and requirements that we need in place to achieve this? Do we have the right people in the right roles? Is everything where it needs to be? What are the initial synergies that we've identified as part of this transaction? What do we need to have in place to make sure that they are realized? Are they still fit for purpose when we look at it pre-transaction versus post-transaction? Are there any gaps in our organization? Is our staffing level at an optimum point? This is important on both a buy and a sell side transaction. If we've brought in an acquisition, do we have to beef up our HR, our IT, our finance teams, our sales force? Equally important on a sell side, if we've carved a piece of a business out, have we planned to right size the rest of the business, that we've still got the right levels of support at the right cost point in the business? How do you fully understand and mitigate your risks? Now, risks move all the time, whether it's pre-deal, during deal, post-deal. And this gives you, it allows you to have a single view around the deal from a risk perspective. And then it almost forces you to make achievable short and long-term growth objectives that are transparent, because you've had to take into account both the operating model and the business model at the same time. So how does it actually work? Now, I'm going to break this up into two areas, pre-investment and post-investment. So pre-investment, have we really understood the market? Do we know what's happening both externally in the market, the broader economy as a whole, the sector, the industry, as well as internally in our own business? What are the initial assessments for your top line synergies? What's the growth rate you're going to try to achieve? Is it growth? Is it an increase in market share? Are we doing this for a competitive advantage or to access a new market? What are those initial risks? And where do we identify the potential areas of overlap in a transaction, as well as operational synergies? Are we going to be able to maximize cost or revenue through this? And the other very important part that sits pre-investment is reviewing the current operating model. I see I've missed that word out there. Apologies. Are we going to be able to put everything in place now? What do we have to put in place now to help a deal get over the line? Or what has to be put in place now to make sure that a post-deal merger is successful? If we then look at it on the other side and go, all right, post-investment, are we actively monitoring what was required from the investment thesis and that we're actually delivering on the returns that we said we would achieve for the transaction? Do we need to review the operating model? Is it still fit for purpose? Or are we hammering a square peg in a round hole and trying to make it work? Those are real questions that have operational impacts to the business. And then the last part, which is the bit I enjoy the most in doing this work, is where do we find additional operating synergies? Are those opportunities for cost improvement? Are we being as efficient and as effective as we need to be? Were the initial pieces of operational improvement, cost savings, cost reductions, pre-investment, are they still fit for purpose now after the deal, or should those be revised? The great thing about this is it's not a buy or a sell side thing. It's done on both sides of the transaction, as I mentioned earlier. But now, if we were to bring all of this together and say, all right, well, what does this actually mean from an overall due diligence perspective? I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with what's currently happening, but I'm saying there's the ability to have more richness that can come into a deal strategy. So if we look at where things sit now, you've got the commercial due diligence that focuses on the external factors, what impacts future performance, it answers those critical questions at a board level. Why are we doing a deal? Financial and legal, that focuses on making sure that the numbers are right, focuses on the historic performance, and makes it an affordable deal. What are we going to be paying? The legal due diligence makes sure that everything is structured correctly. What an operational due diligence brings is it describes the business operationally, and it gives a credible, independent assessment of management plans, the evidences, the sustainability of your operation, and the potential to start to mitigate future risks and quantify additional upsides, both before the deal and after the deal. So for us at RSM, we see this as more of an ODD adding to a holistic deal strategy, that it's not just one. Each piece individually is important, but if we take everything, all four parts of a due diligence together, that's a real deal strategy that has the ability to unlock real value in an organization, both pre-deal or post-deal, and whether we can really get value out of it. Jax, anything you'd like to add from your side?
No, I don't think so, Alistair. I think the main point, I think, which has come across quite clearly in what you've taken us through, is that it needs to have a meaningful deal. Ultimately, we need to have a holistic strategy that takes into account all the different aspects, in order to make the deal a success in essence going forward. And I think that's a very important message from what you've said, and bringing it together on this particular slide.
Great. And everyone, thanks very much. That brings our this webinar to an end. This recording will be sent out to you as soon as it's ready. And where there are questions, we'll answer each of those directly to you individually. Thanks very much.